The Kethmori Council Chamber stretched across 3 kilometers of crystalline architecture, its walls humming with the collective thoughts of 1,000,000,000,000 minds. Today, those minds focused on a single question that had haunted their species for 3 centuries: what to do about the humans. Ambassador Veltar adjusted her ceremonial robes, the fabric shifting through colors that represented emotional states her kind had perfected over millennia. Right now, the deep crimson threading through the material betrayed her anxiety. She had requested this emergency session, knowing full well that the last time humanity had been discussed in this chamber, it had nearly torn their civilization apart. "The motion before us," announced Prime Counselor Zethara, her voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years of leadership, "concerns the species designated as human from the 3rd planet of the Sol system. Ambassador Veltar has requested we reconsider our previous judgment." A wave of emotional resonance swept through the chamber. The Kethmori communicated as much through shared feelings as they did through words, and right now, the dominant emotion was skepticism tinged with old pain. Veltar rose from her position at the speaker's dais. "Honored counselors, 317 years ago, our first contact with humanity ended in what we termed the Great Disappointment. We had detected their radio signals, analyzed their cultural transmissions, and determined them to be a species of remarkable potential. We approached them with open hearts and extended hands." The chamber's ambient light dimmed as historical projections materialized in the center of the room. Images of the first human city the Kethmori had visited flickered to life. New Geneva, gleaming with chrome and glass, humanity's crown jewel of the late 21st century. "We offered them membership in the Galactic Harmony," Veltar continued, her voice growing stronger. "We shared our technology of emotional resonance, our methods of conflict resolution through empathic understanding. We believed they would join us in creating a universe free from violence and suffering." The projection shifted, showing the meeting between the first Kethmori diplomatic team and Earth's United Council. The humans had seemed eager, almost desperate to learn everything about galactic civilization. They had absorbed the Kethmori teachings about emotional balance and peaceful coexistence with the hunger of a species that had nearly destroyed itself in countless wars. "But they failed us," came a voice from the upper tiers. Counselor Nethrim, one of the eldest members of the chamber, had lived through the original contact. "They could not embrace our ways. Their emotions remained chaotic, their thoughts fractured by primitive aggressive impulses. After 17 years of patient teaching, they remained what they had always been, a violent, unpredictable species driven by base instincts." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. Veltar felt the weight of centuries-old disappointment pressing down on her, but she pressed on. "Yes, they struggled with our teachings. Yes, their emotional patterns remained difficult for us to understand, but we made a choice then that I believe was premature. We withdrew from Earth, sealed their star system behind a quantum barrier, and declared them unfit for galactic society. We told ourselves we were protecting the galaxy from their influence, but I submit that we were protecting ourselves from our own failure." The chamber erupted in dissonant emotional feedback. Some counselors projected indignation, others curiosity, and a few, like Veltar, radiated a complex mixture of guilt and hope. Prime Counselor Zethara raised her hand, and silence fell immediately. "You speak of failure, Ambassador, but our records are clear. The humans demonstrated remarkable intelligence, yes, but they also showed concerning tendencies toward deception, manipulation, and violence. When we taught them emotional resonance, some used it to exploit others. When we showed them our peaceful conflict resolution methods, they adapted them into more sophisticated forms of psychological warfare. They took our gifts and weaponized them." "With respect, Prime Counselor," Veltar replied, That assessment may have been colored by our own limitations in understanding them. We approached humanity with the assumption that all intelligent species must develop along the same emotional and social pathways that we did. When they didn't fit our model, we declared them broken. The ambassador gestured, and new projections filled the chamber. These were more recent, gathered by long-range observation probes that had been monitoring Earth from beyond the quantum barrier. These images were captured over the past 50 years, she announced. After we abandoned them, the humans did not collapse into barbarism as some predicted. Instead, they have done something remarkable. They have created a new form of civilization. The images showed sprawling cities, unlike anything in known galactic architecture. Where other species built vertically or in perfect geometric patterns, human cities seemed to grow organically, incorporating natural elements with technology in ways that created functional art. Parks and gardens were woven throughout urban areas, and the buildings themselves seemed to breathe with life. They have developed biotechnology that surpasses our own in some areas, Veltar continued. Not through the elimination of conflict as we achieved, but through the integration of it. They have learned to harness their emotional volatility as a creative force. More images appeared, human art that seemed to pulse with raw emotion, music that made even the Keth Mori observers feel unfamiliar stirrings, literature that explored concepts of meaning and purpose that their own philosophers had never considered. But most importantly, Veltar said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, they have achieved something that we, in all our millennia of existence, have never managed. She paused, letting the tension build in the chamber. The emotional resonance was becoming more complex as curiosity began to override skepticism. They have learned to forgive themselves. The chamber fell into profound silence. For a species that had spent 10,000 years perfecting emotional harmony, the concept of self-forgiveness was alien. The Keth Mori had achieved peace by eliminating the sources of conflict within themselves. They had evolved beyond guilt, beyond shame, beyond the messy complexity of regret. But in doing so, they had also evolved beyond the growth that comes from confronting and overcoming personal failures. I have studied their cultural developments extensively, Veltar continued. After we left them, they went through what they call the time of reflection. They examined every aspect of their history, their failures, their cruelties, and their mistakes. But instead of being crushed by this self-examination, they used it as a foundation for growth. The projections showed human monuments and memorials, but these were unlike any the Keth Mori had seen before. Instead of glorifying victories or perfect leaders, these structures acknowledged mistakes, celebrated learning from failure, and honored those who had suffered from human imperfection. They have developed philosophical frameworks that we dismissed as impossible, Veltar explained. They have learned to hold multiple contradictory truths simultaneously. They can acknowledge that their ancestors committed terrible acts while still honoring the growth that came from recognizing those acts as terrible. They can love imperfect people while working to become better themselves. Counselor Nethrim's emotional projection shifted from skepticism to something approaching concern. You speak as if these are virtues, Ambassador, but what you describe sounds like cognitive dissonance, an inability to achieve the clarity of purpose that marks true enlightenment. Does it? Veltar challenged. Or does it represent a form of enlightenment that we have been too limited to recognize? We achieved peace by eliminating internal conflict. They have achieved something far more complex. They have learned to make peace with internal conflict. She gestured again, and the projections showed human scientific achievements. Fusion reactors that had been designed not just for efficiency, but for beauty. Space stations that served as both research facilities and works of art. Terraforming projects that didn't just make planets habitable, but created entire ecosystems as living sculptures. Their technology has advanced far beyond our projections, she admitted. In some areas, they now exceed our own capabilities. But more than that, they have developed applications we never considered because we had eliminated the emotional complexity that drives such innovations. The chamber was growing restless. Emotional resonance was becoming chaotic as different factions of the council began to form. Some were intrigued by Veltar's revelations, others were deeply disturbed by the implications. "What exactly are you proposing, Ambassador?" Prime Counselor Zethara asked, though her emotional projection suggested she already suspected the answer. "I propose that we lift the quantum barrier around the Sol system," Veltar announced, her voice carrying across the vast chamber with crystalline clarity. "I propose that we approach humanity again, not as teachers this time, but as students. They have achieved something that we, in all our wisdom and emotional mastery, have never accomplished. They have learned to transform pain into strength, conflict into creativity, and failure into wisdom." The chamber erupted in the Keth Mori equivalent of chaos. Emotional projections clashed and mixed, creating a cacophony of feeling that made rational thought nearly impossible. Some counselors were radiating excitement at the possibility of learning new forms of consciousness. Others projected horror at the idea of opening their civilization to human influence again. But beneath it all, Veltar sensed something else: hope. For the first time in centuries, the Keth Mori were being offered the possibility of growth, of discovering new ways of being that their perfect emotional harmony had made impossible. Prime Counselor Zethara stood, her presence commanding immediate attention. "This proposal will require extensive deliberation. The risks of renewed contact with humanity cannot be underestimated. If we are wrong about their development, if they have simply become more sophisticated in their destructive capabilities, we could be inviting catastrophe upon the galaxy." "Yes," Veltar agreed. "But if we are right, if they have truly achieved this new form of enlightenment, then by remaining isolated from them, we are condemning ourselves to stagnation. We have reached the limits of what our form of consciousness can achieve. They may have found a path beyond those limits." As the council session concluded and the chamber began to empty, Veltar remained at her position, staring at the final projection she had prepared but not yet shown. An image of Earth as it appeared today. Not the blue and green marble of their first contact, but something more complex. The planet now showed signs of deliberate ecological management, with weather patterns that had been subtly guided to optimize both natural beauty and agricultural productivity. Cities glowed with bioluminescent lighting systems that worked in harmony with natural circadian rhythms. And in orbit around the planet, a collection of structures that served no apparent practical purpose except to create patterns of light that could be seen from space, turning the entire Earth system into a work of art. It was beautiful in a way that Keth Mori aesthetics couldn't quite categorize, beautiful in its imperfection, in its refusal to conform to any single vision of harmony. It was the beauty of a species that had learned to make art out of its own complexity, to create meaning from chaos without eliminating the chaos itself. The question now was whether the Keth Mori had the courage to learn from the students they had once dismissed as failures. Captain Sarah Chen Okafor stood on the observation deck of the research station Harmony's Edge, watching the impossible sight before her. After 300 years of isolation behind a quantum barrier that had made their star system invisible to the rest of the galaxy, the barrier was dissolving. Streams of exotic particles cascaded past their viewports like aurora made of liquid starlight. "Sensor readings confirm it," reported Dr. James Restrepo from his console. "The quantum matrix is completely destabilizing. Whatever's causing this, it's being done from the outside." Sarah nodded, her expression calm despite the magnitude of what they were witnessing. As director of Humanity's First Contact Division, she had spent her entire career preparing for a moment that many believed would never come. The Keth-Mori had made their position clear 3 centuries ago. Humanity was unfit for galactic society. "Ma'am," called Lieutenant Torres from the communications station, "I'm detecting structured transmissions embedded in the barrier collapse. The patterns match. This is incredible. It's an old Keth-Mori diplomatic frequency." Sarah felt a familiar sensation in her chest, the tightness that came when emotions threatened to overwhelm logical thinking. But rather than suppress it, as her ancestors might have, she acknowledged it, named it curiosity mixed with old hurt, and let it inform her decision-making without controlling it. "Patch it through," she ordered. "Full translation matrix active." The main display shimmered, and suddenly they were looking at a being Sarah recognized from historical records, though this one seemed somehow different from the Keth-Mori they had known centuries ago. The alien's crystalline features shifted through colors that had once indicated emotional states humans could barely comprehend. "I am Ambassador Veltar of the Keth-Mori Council," the being spoke, her voice carrying harmonics that human ears could detect but not quite process. "I am transmitting from the diplomatic vessel Serenity's Dream, currently positioned at the edge of your star system. I request permission to approach your primary inhabited world for the purpose of reconciliation." The word hung in the air, like a bridge across centuries of separation. Sarah looked around the observation deck at her team, reading their expressions with the emotional literacy that had become second nature to post-contact humanity. Excitement from Dr. Restrepo, wariness from Lieutenant Torres, and from Chief Engineer Patel, something that looked remarkably like vindication. "Open a channel," Sarah instructed. When the connection was established, she stepped forward. "Ambassador Veltar, this is Captain Sarah Chen Okafor, Director of First Contact Operations for the Terran Federation. Your transmission is received and understood. Before we proceed, I must ask, what has changed?" The pause that followed was pregnant with implications. On the screen, Veltar's coloration shifted through what Sarah's cultural training told her were patterns of uncertainty and... was that shame? "We have come to realize," Veltar said slowly, "that our previous assessment of humanity may have been incomplete. We judged you by standards that perhaps revealed more about our own limitations than your capabilities." Sarah felt that emotional tightness in her chest again, but this time it was different. Hope, yes, but also caution born from hard-won wisdom. Humanity had spent 3 centuries learning from their failures, and one of the most important lessons had been about the danger of wanting approval so desperately that you lost sight of your own worth. "Ambassador, we appreciate your honesty. However, I'm sure you'll understand that we need more than an acknowledgement of possible misjudgment. Our species has grown significantly since our last contact. We're not the same people you knew then, and frankly, we're not sure we want the same things we wanted then." This seemed to surprise Veltar. Her coloration shifted to patterns Sarah didn't recognize from the old diplomatic guides. "You do not wish to join galactic civilization?" the ambassador asked. "We are galactic civilization," Sarah replied. "The question is whether we wish to rejoin a community that rejected us, and if so, on what terms." The statement wasn't delivered with hostility, but with the quiet confidence of a species that had learned to value itself. Over the centuries, humanity had developed what their philosophers called dignified resilience, the ability to remain open to relationship while refusing to beg for acceptance. Dr. Restrepo stepped forward. "Ambassador, if I may, we've made significant advances in emotional resonance technology since your departure. Perhaps a cultural exchange demonstration would be appropriate?" Sarah nodded. It was a good suggestion. If the Keth-Mori were serious about reconciliation, they needed to understand how much humanity had changed. "We would be honored to receive a delegation," Sarah said. "However, I should warn you that our methods of emotional resonance may be quite different from what you remember. Veltar's coloration shifted again, this time to what looked like curiosity. Different how? You taught us that emotional harmony required the elimination of internal conflict, Sarah explained. We've discovered that it's possible to achieve harmony through the integration of conflict. Our resonance technology doesn't suppress difficult emotions. Instead, it helps beings process and learn from them. The ambassador's image flickered slightly, suggesting she was consulting with others aboard her ship. When she returned her attention to the screen, her coloration had settled into a pattern Sarah didn't recognize. Captain Chen Okafor, I must be honest. Our council is divided on the wisdom of renewed contact. Some of our people fear that human emotional volatility could destabilize our society. Others believe we have something to learn from your alternative approach. Sarah appreciated the honesty. It reminded her of something her grandmother had taught her. Trust beings who admit their own uncertainty over those who claim to have all the answers. Then let's start small, she suggested. A limited cultural exchange on Harmony's edge. Your delegation can observe our emotional resonance techniques, and we can learn about how your society has developed since our last contact. No commitments beyond mutual understanding. Within 6 hours, the Kethmori vessel had docked with their station. Sarah waited in the main reception bay as the airlock cycled, curious about what 3 centuries of separate development had done to both their species. When the doors opened, Ambassador Veltar stepped through, and Sarah immediately noticed the differences. The Kethmori she remembered from historical records had moved with perfect grace, their every gesture calculated for optimal emotional resonance. Veltar moved with something more complex, grace that included hesitation, confidence that acknowledged its own limits. Captain Chen Okafor, Veltar said, approaching with arms extended in what Sarah recognized as a traditional Kethmori greeting of respect. Thank you for receiving us. Sarah returned the gesture, but added something new. She placed her right hand over her heart, a human gesture that had evolved to indicate sincere emotional openness. Welcome to Harmony's Edge, Ambassador. We're honored by your presence. As their hands met, Sarah felt it. A subtle resonance, different from what the historical records described. Instead of the overwhelming flood of perfect tranquility that Kethmori contact had once produced, she felt something more nuanced. Veltar's emotional state was complex, layered with uncertainty and hope, and what felt remarkably like nervous excitement. You feel different, Veltar said, her coloration shifting to patterns of surprise. Your emotional signature is much more stable than our records indicated was possible for your species. 300 years of practice, Sarah replied with a smile. Would you like to see how we've developed? The tour that followed was a revelation for both species. Sarah led Veltar and her small delegation through the station's various cultural centers, each one demonstrating different aspects of human emotional development. In the Conflict Resolution Center, they observed a mediation session between 2 research teams who disagreed about resource allocation. Instead of suppressing their disagreement or having it resolved by higher authority, the teams used what humans called productive argument protocols. They acknowledged their emotions, explored the underlying values that drove their positions, and worked together to find solutions that honored both perspectives. Fascinating, murmured one of Veltar's companions, a being introduced as cultural analyst Kephiron. They maintain their individual perspectives while achieving functional cooperation. In the creativity labs, they watched artists and scientists working together on projects that combined aesthetic beauty with practical function. A team was developing new solar collector designs that would not only gather energy more efficiently, but create patterns of light and shadow that enhanced the psychological well-being of anyone living near them. We eliminated creative conflict because we saw it as wasteful, Veltar observed. but you've learned to use it as fuel. But it was in the memorial garden that the real breakthrough occurred. This section of the station was dedicated to humanity's failures, wars they had fought, mistakes they had made, people they had hurt. But unlike traditional memorials, these weren't monuments to shame or guilt. They were celebrations of learning. "This memorial is for the water wars of 2156, Sarah explained, standing before a sculpture that somehow managed to convey both the tragedy of conflict and the beauty of the ecological restoration that had followed. 40 million people died fighting over water rights, but their deaths taught us to develop the hydrosynthesis technologies that made water scarcity impossible." Veltar's coloration was shifting rapidly through patterns Sarah had never seen before. "You honor your failures?" "We honor the growth that came from our failures," Sarah corrected. "We've learned that shame and guilt are only useful if they motivate positive change. Once they've served that purpose, holding on to them becomes just another form of self-indulgence." The ambassador stood silently before the memorial for several minutes. When she finally spoke, her voice carried harmonics of something that sounded like wonder. "We eliminated shame from our society," she said quietly. "We thought this was enlightenment. But in doing so, we also eliminated the possibility of redemption. You cannot experience the joy of overcoming failure if you never allow yourself to fail." As the tour concluded, Sarah found herself feeling something unexpected: sympathy for the Keth Mori. They had achieved their perfect emotional harmony, but in doing so, they had trapped themselves in a kind of static perfection that prevented further growth. "Ambassador," she said as they returned to the docking bay, "would you be interested in a longer exchange program? Perhaps some of your people could live here for a while and some of ours could visit your worlds?" Veltar's coloration brightened to patterns that clearly indicated hope. "I believe my council would find such an arrangement educational." As the Keth Mori delegation prepared to return to their ship, Veltar paused at the airlock. "Captain Chen Okafor, may I ask you a personal question?" "Of course." "Do you forgive us for abandoning your species when you needed guidance?" Sarah considered the question carefully. The old human response might have been immediate reassurance. An eager "of course" designed to smooth over conflict. But she had learned better. "Ambassador, forgiveness isn't something you give to make someone else feel better," she said gently. "It's something you do for yourself when you're ready to move forward without being controlled by past hurts. We forgave you centuries ago, not because you deserved it, but because we deserved to grow beyond the pain of rejection." Veltar's coloration shifted to what Sarah was beginning to recognize as profound respect. "Perhaps," the ambassador said, "you could teach us about that as well." 2 years after first contact was re-established, the Galactic Harmony Council convened an emergency session. But this time, the vast crystalline chamber held more than just Keth Mori delegates. Representatives from 17 different species filled the ancient halls, and for the first time in galactic history, humans sat among them as full voting members. Ambassador Veltar stood at the central dais, but she was no longer alone. Beside her stood Captain Sarah Chen Okafor, now officially designated as Terra's ambassador to the Galactic Council. Between them lay a document that would reshape the fundamental structure of galactic civilization. "The Harmony Accords," Veltar announced, her voice carrying across the chamber with crystalline clarity, "represent more than a treaty of alliance. They represent the evolution of our understanding of consciousness itself." Prime Counselor Zethara observed from her traditional position, but even she had changed over the past 2 years. Her perfect emotional control now seemed less like enlightenment and more like a beautiful but limited form of existence. She had requested to participate in what humans called emotional integration therapy, and the results had been illuminating. 2 years ago, Sarah continued, stepping forward with the easy confidence that had become her trademark, we were two very different species with seemingly incompatible approaches to consciousness and society. The Cathamori had achieved perfect emotional harmony through the elimination of internal conflict. Humanity had learned to thrive by integrating conflict as a tool for growth. The chamber was filled with beings from across the galaxy, each representing species that had been watching the human-Cathamori cultural exchange with intense interest. The Vorthak, whose crystalline thought matrices had been considered the pinnacle of logical reasoning. The ethereal Jalin, who communicated through shared sensory experiences. The Quantum Collective, whose consciousness existed partially outside normal space-time. All of them had come because something unprecedented was happening. Two radically different approaches to consciousness were not just coexisting, but creating something entirely new together. The integration has exceeded our most optimistic projections, reported Dr. Elena Vasquez, the lead researcher from the Joint Human-Cathamori Consciousness Studies project. Cathamori volunteers who underwent emotional integration training showed a 347% increase in creative problem-solving abilities within 6 months. Murmurs of interest swept through the chamber. The Cathamori had been the galactic standard for peaceful conflict resolution for millennia. The idea that they could become even more capable was shocking. Simultaneously, continued Dr. Kefiron, Veltar's former cultural analyst who had become the first Cathamori to fully master human emotional integration techniques, human volunteers who learned our emotional harmony methods showed remarkable improvements in stress management and long-term planning capabilities. Sarah smiled. She had been one of those volunteers, and the experience had been transformative. Learning to temporarily achieve the kind of emotional clarity that came naturally to the Cathamori had given her a new appreciation for both approaches to consciousness. But the real breakthrough, she said, came when we stopped trying to choose between our methods and started combining them. The chamber fell silent as holographic displays materialized throughout the space. The images showed the results of 2 years of intensive cooperation. Cities that were simultaneously perfectly harmonious and dynamically creative, technologies that achieved both optimal efficiency and aesthetic beauty, art that conveyed both emotional depth and mathematical precision. We call it dynamic harmony, Veltar explained, her coloration shifting through patterns that now included emotional ranges she had learned from human teachers. Instead of eliminating conflict to achieve peace, or integrating conflict to achieve growth, we have learned to move fluidly between both states as circumstances require. The implications were staggering. Ambassador Ket Hall of the Vorthak Collective leaned forward, his crystalline features refracting light in patterns of intense interest. You are saying that consciousness itself can be modular? That beings can learn to think in fundamentally different ways depending on the situation. Not just learn, Sarah replied. Master. We've discovered that consciousness is far more flexible than any of us realized. The limitations we thought were inherent to our species were actually just the boundaries of our imagination. Prime Counselor Zethara rose slowly, her movements carrying a new kind of grace that incorporated both Cathamori perfection and human spontaneity. If this is true, she said, then the implications extend far beyond our two species. You are suggesting that all forms of consciousness in the galaxy could potentially be enhanced? We're not just suggesting it, Dr. Vasquez replied. We're proving it. New displays activated, showing data from preliminary experiments with other species. The ethereal Jilin, who had always communicated purely through sensory sharing, had learned to incorporate human emotional processing techniques, allowing them to share not just experiences, but the meaning those experiences held. The Quantum Collective had begun experimenting with Keth-Mori emotional harmony, discovering that it allowed their distributed consciousness to achieve forms of coherence they had never imagined possible. Each species brings unique strengths, Sarah explained. The Vorthak's logical processing, the Jalin's experiential communication, the Quantum Collective's multidimensional thinking. But until now, we've all been limited by the assumption that we had to choose one approach to consciousness and stick with it. What we're proposing, Veltar added, is a galaxy where beings can learn from each other's forms of consciousness without losing their own identity, where diversity of thought becomes a resource that all species can access. The silence that followed was profound. They were talking about nothing less than the voluntary evolution of consciousness on a galactic scale. Ambassador Theiss of the Jalin Communion spoke first, her words carrying the layered harmonics that indicated deep emotional resonance. The humans have already transformed the Keth-Mori, the species we all look to as the pinnacle of mental discipline. If this transformation is possible for them, what might be possible for the rest of us? There would be risks, warned Counselor Nethram, though his tone lacked the skepticism that had once characterized his views on humanity. Fundamental changes to consciousness could destabilize entire civilizations. Yes, Sarah agreed readily. There would be risks. Change always involves risk, but stagnation is also a risk. How many problems remain unsolved in our galaxy because we've limited ourselves to only one way of thinking about them? She gestured, and new images filled the chamber. Star systems where environmental collapse had been deemed irreversible, species conflicts that had dragged on for millennia because no acceptable solution could be found, technologies that had stalled because they required forms of creativity that no single species possessed. We're not suggesting that everyone should become the same, Veltar clarified. We're suggesting that everyone should have access to the full spectrum of consciousness that life in this galaxy has developed. Remain Vorthak, but learn to feel as deeply as humans when the situation calls for it. Stay Keth-Mori, but access the creative chaos of human thinking when innovation is needed. Dr. Kef Iron stepped forward, his hybrid communication style now seamlessly blending Keth-Mori harmonic precision with human emotional directness. I have lived as both forms of consciousness now, he said. I can tell you that I am still fundamentally Keth-Mori, but I am also more than I was before. The integration doesn't diminish identity, it expands capability. The debate that followed lasted for days. Representatives returned to their home worlds to consult with their governments, philosophers, and citizens. Some species were immediately intrigued by the possibilities. Others were concerned about the potential for cultural contamination or loss of identity. But gradually, consensus began to emerge. The galaxy had reached a point where traditional approaches to consciousness were no longer sufficient to address the challenges they faced. Climate management across dozens of worlds required forms of long-term thinking that no single species had mastered. Resource distribution across interstellar distances needed both perfect logical optimization and intuitive understanding of cultural needs. First contact with species beyond their current understanding would require mental flexibility that none of them possessed alone. When the final vote was taken, the Harmony Accords passed with overwhelming support. The treaty established a new framework for galactic civilization, one based not on the dominance of any single approach to consciousness, but on the voluntary sharing and integration of all approaches. Today, Prime Counselor Zathara announced as she signed the accords, we begin a new chapter in the story of consciousness itself. We move beyond the limitations that have defined us and toward possibilities we have never imagined. As the ceremony concluded, Sarah found herself standing with Veltar in one of the chamber's meditation alcoves, looking out at a view that showed dozens of different starships from across the galaxy, each representing a species now committed to this unprecedented experiment in consciousness evolution. "Do you think it will work?" Veltar asked, her coloration cycling through patterns of hope and uncertainty. Sarah considered the question with the hybrid thinking style she had developed, first accessing the emotional wisdom that told her this felt right, then applying Kethmori logical analysis to examine potential outcomes, then returning to human intuition to synthesize a response. "I think," she said finally, "that we're about to find out what's possible when beings stop limiting themselves to only one way of being conscious. And I suspect the results are going to surprise all of us." 5 years later, the galaxy had indeed been surprised. Technologies that had been stalled for centuries were suddenly advancing rapidly as species combined their different forms of consciousness to solve complex problems. Art forms were emerging that no single species could have created alone. Diplomatic solutions were being found to conflicts that had seemed intractable. But perhaps most importantly, beings across the galaxy were discovering that they were capable of far more than they had ever believed possible. The Kethmori had learned to dream with the wild creativity of humans while maintaining their emotional wisdom. Humans had learned to achieve the kind of mental clarity that allowed for planning across centuries while keeping their innovative chaos. Other species were finding their own unique combinations of consciousness skills. The galaxy hadn't become homogeneous. If anything, it had become more diverse, as beings discovered new ways to express their fundamental nature through expanded consciousness capabilities. And at the center of it all was a simple truth that humanity had learned centuries ago during their time of isolation. Growth comes not from eliminating your limitations, but from learning to transcend them while honoring what made you unique in the first place. The species that had once been rejected as too chaotic for galactic civilization had become the catalyst for the greatest expansion of consciousness in galactic history. Their name was now spoken with reverence across 1,000 worlds. The species that had taught the galaxy how to forgive its own limitations and grow beyond them. Humanity had been forgiven once. Now their name had become legend, not for what they had conquered, but for what they had taught the galaxy to become.